couldn't decide, did I want to go and find some existing mythology or folklore that supported the idea I had, or write my own whole, cosmology kind of thing? What do you guys feel about that? You mentioned the idea of going back to some of the old gods and the old stories of folklore. Do you think there's an advantage or disadvantage to using existing gods and such, or making your own?
Well, I think if you're making your own, that gives you 100% leeway. If I was going to do like Sumerian or Babylonian mythology, that kind of puts me in that research mode. On the other hand, saying I'm going to do a novel based on Sumerian mythology, there's a framework for it. I don't have to come up with the hierarchy of gods and what they do and their servants if they're human. I'm just thinking Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythology and all the details that go with that. Personally, on the other hand, I would just write the book. You know what? Just get the story out and see how it feels as you're going through. You can create your own mythology from all that. Well, this is an interesting idea from Babylonian mythology. Here's an interesting idea from Greek mythology. That sounds really cool, and create your own that way. The benefit of that is you can take it as many stories as you want to because you've got this basic mythology idea, and then you could go in and explore different aspects of what that means in the past, what that means in the present to people who are still part of that mythology. Has that mythology gone underground? Is it just cult now? Is it something that's widely acceptable, or is it practiced in dark caves on full moons when the stars are almost aligned correctly because they never can be, or else?
You also, question what would the reading audience want. And, I mean, we keep talking about vampires. It sounds like we've all, spent a great deal of time with them. What is a vampire? Who defines it? Are we talking Bram Stoker's vampires? Are we talking Anne Rice? Are we talking Stephanie Myers? God forbid.
No, we're not.
We're short of that.
They're horrible. It's horribly written, officially. But, let's be very honest about Stephanie Myers and what she did. She changed vampires and found an audience for them, made a crap load of money.
Yeah.
So, do you go with an establishment? Because then you have to do the research. You got to get the details right. Or do you start from scratch where you have to do all the work? Or do you kind of merge the two? You take something that exists, you tweak it on your own, and you hope that the audience is going to accept that. Because they might not. They might get really angry, or they might love it.
I know from just an example, which is funny that you brought that question up, because a friend and I were talking about that. And in the video game world, many years ago in video game time, 2 video games came out, multiplayer online RPGs came out, and one became wildly successful, and it's still played today, World of Warcraft. You probably heard of it. And another one, Asheron's Call, did not do so well. And she thinks that, after studying it and being a folklore researcher, was that World of Warcraft really took familiar things, give them a little twist, but was able to kind of make that connection with the players. Whereas Asheron's Call was trying to develop things wholly new, wholly different, creatures that nobody ever heard of, and nobody could connect with it. So it's kind of like you can make an argument either way, because if writers thought like that, perhaps we wouldn't have Cthulhu or anything like that. On the other hand, sometimes it's good to kind of take something that's sort of familiar and put your own twist on it, and maybe you'll find a connection. You're not too far out there where nobody's going to understand it. Even we joke about Lovecraft. During his time, maybe not as popular as he's becoming now. So you can also be ahead of your time as well. So
and there's something to be said for familiarity. Readers tend to like to know kind of what they're getting. So I mean, me personally, I like to try to base all my stuff on something that actually exists, even if I'm going to use it. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll take what really exists and I'll look at it like a couple different cultures. Like if I was going to do a mythology or something, I'd look at a couple of different world mythologies and then say, okay, so I'm going to create what might be like the truth behind all of these. Like this is what became into these. So I do that with the vampires. I do a presentation, which caused me to learn a whole lot about vampires from folklore all around the world and how they developed into literature in modern day. And the vampires we have today, the typical vampire we think of, bears almost no resemblance to a lot of the vampires in world folklore that actually people used to tell stories about. We owe most of our modern vampire to novelists, to Polidori, Stoker, Sheridan Le Fanu. A lot of them in the Victorian age created the image of the vampire that we now have, and it had very little to do with the original. So, I mean, there's a good balance for both. I think take something that works and make it your own. All right, how are we doing on time?
You have plenty of time.
Oh,
I got a question.
oh, okay. What questions from the panelists?
Favorite book? Why?
Oh,
Favorite book? I'll go first because I have an answer prepared,
well, that's good.
and I'll give you guys time to think.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming
Sure,
prepared,
sure.
Mr. Fritz.
Well, actually, I got snookered into this one too many times because my students ask all the time, "What's your favorite book? What's your favorite book?" And finally, I'm like, I gotta come up with an answer for this one.
It's hard.
So I'm gonna ignore the how I got there. My answer is Stephen King, The Long Walk, which is not a typical answer.
One of his Bachman books.
Yes, one of his Bachman books. It was actually the very first novel he ever wrote. In fact, he wrote it at the age of 17 to try to impress a girl.
Nice.
And it didn't work, and it wasn't published, and then he wrote Carrie and a couple others, and then right as the Bachman thing was starting, where he was producing too much, a product, he was basically, I can do 2 books a year, so he came up with this idea, I'll have this alternate ego, and I'll produce these other books, and The Long Walk is one of those. He pulled it out of the trunk and, vastly improved it, obviously. But why do I love it so much? If you're not familiar with the story, here's the basics. Every year, 100 boys between, I think it's the age of 16 and 19, they might be a little bit younger.
Oh, I thought they were younger.
Maybe
They were
14.
like 14.
Yeah, it could be as young as 14, but definitely up to 19. They volunteer to participate in a contest, which is the biggest sporting event of the year. It's like the Super Bowl times 100. It's absolutely massive. The entire country rallies around this thing. And they meet at the northernmost point in Maine on Route 1, and it's just the 100 of them and the major, the guy who is running the whole show, and that's it. There are no cameras. The families aren't allowed to be there. It's just the 101 of them, plus a couple of guards. And they start. And what they do is they start walking. And they have to maintain a speed of 4 miles an hour, which Stephen King has already admitted that was probably a little too fast. He didn't do his research. It should have been more like 3 or 3.5 miles an hour.
Yeah, 4 is.
Four is pretty brisk.
Mm-hmm.
But here's what happens in the story. They must stay on the road. They may not interfere with other players. And they must maintain 4 miles an hour. If they drop below 4 miles an hour, they will get a warning. They have a little thing on their belt which keeps track of their speed. If they can walk for an hour without getting a warning, they will remove one of the old warnings. So the warnings can go on and off, on and off. First warning, second warning. If you get your third warning, you're shot and killed on the spot. And the game is to kill 99 teenage boys, and one will survive and get the prize is anything you want for the rest of your life. I've read this 7 times now, and I swear to you, it's the only book in my life. I genuinely find it better every time I read it. I don't just say that. It really is better every time I read it. And it's because this is a microcosm of all of society squeezed into these 100 boys. There is the best friend who basically sacrifices himself at the right time. There's the jackass who's trying to psychologically mess you up so that you make a mistake. There's the jock who can physically beat everybody, and he trained, and he ends up losing because he gets diarrhea. Something you can't control. The major, the guy running the whole show, he is authority. Think about children, not being able to control, always wanting to fight back, and they don't get along with their parents, they don't get along with their teachers. So these kids, once they start, they can't quit. And, they start out, they all kind of admire the major, but as it gets worse and worse, and they realize, oh my God, this is real, like, I'm actually going to die here, the Major becomes a true antagonist for them. We know he's the antagonist from the beginning, but they start to figure it out. But the best character of all is the crowd, because the crowd starts out as nobody, and then after like 5 or 10 miles, it's peppered in. You have a couple of people who are like, hey, way to go, you know, because they've gone a few miles. And as they get further and further, these boys end up going a couple of 100 miles for like 4 or 5 days without sleeping. And there are more and more people, and the crowd becomes more and more frantic until by the end of the story, you have 10 or 15 rows deep cameras and thousands of people, and they are literally chanting for these poor, you know, boys who are on the verge of death just from walking to just take one more step. And it's this amazing commentary on, you know, the group mentality, the mob mentality about the entertainment industry. There's so much. It's such a really rich story.
I also love it when somebody gets shot.
Yeah, it's amazing.
They're also cheering for
They
that.
cheer when somebody dies, you know.
Yeah, groupies, remember the groupie scene?
Yeah. So, you know, if you've never heard it, or it's been a long time since you've read it, do give it another shot. I'm telling you, it's really quite brilliant. That's my answer. Who's figured something out now?
Now we want to talk that.
I know. Yeah.
That was a really good. I have. Oh God.
Can I ask you a subversion that might help you?
Sure.
It's funny because when you asked that, is the book that you read, that when you read it said, this is what I want to do.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
That's yeah.
I don't know if there was. God, I can't remember if there was one. I always wanted to be a writer, but I think probably my favorite book, I'm going to say was Red Dragon by Thomas Harris. And that one, again, it hit me at kind of a formative age. I mean, kind of a runner-up would be maybe The Vampire Lestat by Anne Rice, because that sort of kicked off my vampire obsession. But as a piece of like literature, I don't know, Red Dragon, for those of you who aren't familiar, it's the book that comes before Silence of the Lambs. It's the book where Hannibal Lecter was first introduced. And in my opinion, it's actually still a superior novel to Silence of the Lambs, as good as Silence was. Red Dragon is a better book because Thomas Harris, without being, he is not a sentimental writer at all. He's not the usual kind of thing. He started off as a reporter, and he writes in a very sort of matter-of-fact, you know, kind of style. He doesn't get real into all the characters, you know, feelings and this and that. And it's weird because normally that's what I go for. Normally I like very rich, detailed characters. And Harris was brilliant just because he gives you enough. He gives you enough to get the character and to care about them and understand what's going on, but he leaves them a little mysterious, especially with like Hannibal Lecter. Even though you get a few scenes even from Hannibal Lecter's point of view, he's still a mystery, you know, and he's a brilliant character. He's only in there a little bit, you know, in his first appearance. But the real crowning achievement is the character of Francis Dolarhyde, who is basically a serial murderer who goes around and murders entire families. And you first see him completely from the outside, from the investigators. You learn all the horrible stuff he's done. By the end of the book, I was almost like crying for the guy. Like I wanted a happy ending for this guy who had murdered 3 families and was planning on doing it again. That's how powerful the writing of his character and backstory and all that was. And to me, that was just a triumph. I went, if you can make a character like that somebody that I care about, you know, that's good writing. That to me said that's what I want to be able to do. I want to be able to write something that can have that effect on people.